The wind across the Nebraska plains in late October has a sound like tearing fabric. It is a dry, relentless noise that promises a future of ice and emptiness. Against this sound, two figures moved with a rhythm that was at once desperate and deliberate. Anya and Kotia, 18 years old and identical but for the different patterns of dust on their canvas trousers, were leaning into the weight of a crude travo made from lashed poles. On it sat a heavy, burlap-wrapped block of river clay, dug from a bank 3 miles distant. The effort carved lines of concentration onto their faces, yet their eyes were clear. Their German shepherd, Wolf, trotted beside them, his head low against the wind, his presence a silent, steadying anchor in the vast, indifferent landscape. From a distance, their destination was a scar on the horizon, a line of rust half swallowed by the prairie grass. It was the wreck of a single freight car, a forgotten ghost from a railroad spur that had gone bankrupt a decade before. To any observer, their labor would have looked like madness. They were hauling earth to a metal tomb. The prairie was already full of earth. Their small, vulnerable wooden cabin, the one their parents had built and died in, stood a quarter-mile away, a monument to conventional struggle. This new obsession with the steel carcass seemed like a symptom of grief, a strange ritual enacted by two young women left utterly alone in a world that had little room for sentiment or strange rituals. But if you looked closer, past the absurdity of the scene, you would see the intelligence. You would see the way they chose their path, using the lee of a shallow rise to shield them from the worst of the wind. You would see the precision in their knots, the careful balance of their load. They were not performing a ritual. They were executing a plan. The prairie was a text, and they were its most devoted readers. They had seen the way the bison huddled with their backs to the storm, the way the badger dug its burrow deep and turned it away from the prevailing wind. They had learned that survival on the plains was not about fighting the cold. It was about getting out of its way. And that derelict railcar, which everyone else saw as junk, was the perfect place to hide. The community saw two orphans lost in a fantasy. The community was wrong. The railcar was a thing of iron and decay. When they first found it, tucked into a washout and half buried by a decade of shifting soil, it was not a shelter. It was a container for shadows. Sunlight pierced its rusted-out sections in dusty, angelic shafts, illuminating a floor of rotted wood and the nests of long-gone rodents. The wind moaned through it, a low, mournful note played on a steel flute. Where others saw only wreckage, a final monument to failed ambition, Anya and Kotia saw geometry. They saw a shell, structurally sound, 40 feet long and 9 feet wide. They saw a sealed vessel, impervious to the gnawing of mice and the relentless, soul-stealing wind. Its curved roof was designed to shed weight, and the thick steel walls, while cold to the touch, did not yield. They were absolute. Their first task was not construction, but deconstruction. For weeks, they worked with pry bars and hammers, tearing out the rotten floorboards until only the steel skeleton remained. They swept and scraped, removing every trace of rust, every patch of dirt, their movements a synchronized dance of shared purpose. They spoke little, their communication a shorthand of gestures and knowing glances. Kotia would point to a stubborn bolt, and Anya would arrive with the right tool. Anya would test a seam for integrity, and Kotia would be ready with a bucket of pitch they'd rendered themselves to seal it. Wolf would lie in the sliver of shade cast by the car, his head on his paws, watching them with an unwavering, proprietary gaze. This was not the frenzied work of desperation. It was the patient, methodical labor of engineers. They were preparing a foundation. The railcar was not the house. It was the fortress wall, the first and most important layer of a defense system so subtle, its genius would be entirely invisible to the outside world. They were building an answer to a question the prairie was about to ask, a question that would kill anyone who answered it incorrectly. The cold was coming. Not the ordinary cold of a prairie winter, but a deep and ancient cold. They could feel it in the stillness of the air at dawn, in the way the stars seemed to crackle with a brittle light. They were not building a home. They were building an ark for an ocean of white. A trip to the settlement of Prairie Ridge was a necessary evil, a journey into a world of noise and judgment. The town was a small collection of sod houses and false-fronted wooden buildings that huddled together as if for warmth. Here, the currency was not just coin, but conformity. Mr. Drummond, proprietor of the general store, was the town's unofficial arbiter of common sense. He was a large man whose suspenders strained against the logic of his own belly. He watched Anyar and Cottier load their wagon with a skeptical eye, taking in the sacks of raw, greasy wool, the bolts of heavy canvas, the tins of tallow. His gaze lingered on the sheer quantity. "You girls planning on clothing an army?" he boomed, wiping his hands on his apron. His voice was the kind that expected an audience. A few men loitering by the stove turned to listen. Anyar continued to methodically stack the supplies, her face unreadable. It was Cottier who answered, her voice quiet but carrying a strange weight of precision. "We require a specific thermal resistance. The lanolin in unprocessed wool provides superior hydrophobic properties." Drummond stared, his mouth slightly agape. The men by the stove exchanged confused glances. He had been expecting a simple answer: new blankets, winter coats. He had been given a sentence from a book he'd never seen. He recovered, falling back on the comfort of loud, simple wisdom. "That's a lot of fancy words for foolishness. Winter is coming on hard. You two should be taking shelter in town, not playing house in the dirt. A proper man would have seen to a decent soddy for you by now, not let you run wilder." His pronouncement was met with grunts of agreement. He was reinforcing the known world, the world of thick sod walls and roaring fires. The sisters, with their strange purchases and quiet intensity, were a deviation. They were an uncomfortable question. Cottier simply looked at him, her gaze direct. "A soddy loses heat to the ground," she said, as if stating the time. "It is a thermal bridge." She turned and climbed onto the wagon seat, leaving Mr. Drummond sputtering, his argument deflated by a term he didn't understand. As they pulled away, the whispers followed them, a wake of pity and dismissal. They were the grieving orphans, the strange twins, lost to reason. The concern of the community was not always delivered with the blunt force of mockery. Sometimes, it came wrapped in the genuine warmth of a neighbor's worry. Mrs. Gable was a kind woman whose face was a roadmap of prairie hardships. She lived with her husband and 3 sons on a homestead 2 miles east, and she had known the girl's mother. One afternoon, she made the journey to their small cabin, her horse picking its way through the frost-hardened ruts. She found the place eerily quiet, the cabin itself looking unused, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney more from habit than habitation. She found the sisters out by the railcar, their hands chapped and red, methodically packing a mixture of clay and dried grass into a low wall inside the steel shell. Wolf growled softly at her approach before Anyar quieted him with a touch. Mrs. Gable dismounted, her expression a mixture of awe and profound concern. "Girls," she began, her voice gentle, "what is this? I hear the talk in town. Drummond says you're building this." She gestured to the iron hulk, her hand trembling slightly. "This is no place to spend a winter. It's a coffin of ice. You must let my Thomas and the boys come help you. We can add another room to your cabin, bank it properly with sod. It's not right, you two out here alone." Her plea was heartfelt, an extension of the communal obligation to protect the vulnerable. She saw 2 lost lambs wandering toward a cliff. Anyar, who rarely spoke, was the one to answer. She wiped her hands on a rag, her movements unhurried. She looked from Mrs. Gable's worried face to the half-finished interior of the railcar. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Gable. But a coffin is a thing that touches the earth," Anyar said, her voice low and even. "It gives up its warmth. We are building something that floats." The statement was so strange, so poetic and yet so technical, that Mrs. Gable could only stare. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the finality in the tone. They were refusing help. They were choosing this path, this cold, metal thing over the warmth of community and the proven safety of a sod house. She tried one more time. "The first blizzard will turn this thing to a block of solid ice. You'll freeze in your sleep." Cottier looked up from her work, her eyes meeting the older woman's. "No," she said, with a certainty that was more chilling than any winter wind. "We won't." Mrs. Gable left with a heavy heart, convinced she had just spoken to 2 young women who were already ghosts. The sisters' genius was not in the materials they used, but but in the spaces they left between them. The secret to their arc was the concept of the void. Stay with me, because to understand how they would survive a cold that could shatter steel, you have to understand the principle they had grasped with such intuitive clarity: you cannot stop the cold, you can only disconnect from it. Their first act inside the cleaned-out railcar was to build a floor that did not touch the floor. Using stones and salvaged timbers, they constructed a raised platform, 6 inches high, creating a pocket of dead air between them and the frozen ground beneath the car. This was their first and most crucial thermal break. They were building an island. Upon this platform, they laid a thick base of the clay and grass mixture, a dense, solid mass that would serve as a thermal battery, slow to cool and slow to warm. Then came the walls. They did not simply attach insulation to the steel. That would be like putting a single blanket on a man lying in a frozen river. The steel would steal the heat right through it. Instead, they built a second, smaller room inside the railcar. They erected a simple wooden frame, set a full foot away from the interior steel walls. This created the most important element of their design: a wide, continuous air gap. A buffer zone. A place where the cold could live, but not cross. Into the cavities of this inner frame, they packed the raw, lanolin-rich wool Mr. Drummond had scoffed at. They packed it densely, creating a barrier nearly a foot thick. The natural oils in the wool repelled moisture, preventing the insulation from becoming a frozen, useless mass. Over this, they stretched the heavy canvas, pulling it taut and sealing the seams with the pitch and tallow mixture. When they were done, they had created a room within a room, a soft, insulated cocoon floating in the center of a cold, iron shell. From the outside, it was still just a rusted boxcar. But inside, it was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. They had broken the bridge. The ravenous cold of the prairie could claim the steel, but it could not reach across the empty space to touch them. A shelter is more than just walls, it is a functioning ecosystem. With the thermal envelope complete, Anya and Kotia turned their attention to the systems that would sustain life within it. Heat was the most critical. A traditional fireplace or a large pot-belly stove would be disastrously inefficient, consuming their precious fuel and creating dangerous drafts. Their solution was a marvel of miniaturization. Using sections of stovepipe, fire bricks scavenged from a ruined chimney, and more of their versatile clay and grass mortar, they constructed a small, dense stove near the center of the room. It was designed for efficiency, not output. Its secret was a long, convoluted flue pipe that snaked back and forth across the ceiling before venting through the roof. This design forced the hot exhaust gases to travel a much greater distance inside the living space, allowing the air to strip them of their heat before they escaped. It was a radiator and a stove in one. The vent itself was a double-pipe system, a pipe within a pipe, which used the heat of the exhaust to pre-warm the incoming air for combustion, making the fire burn hotter and more completely with less fuel. Air quality was the next problem. In a nearly airtight space, a fire and 2 breathing humans would quickly consume the oxygen. They engineered a simple but brilliant ventilation system. Near the floor, a small, baffled intake pipe drew cold, dense air from the outside. It was designed with several bends, forcing the air to slow down and warm slightly before it entered the room, preventing a cold draft. High on the opposite wall, a small, closable outlet allowed the warm, moist air from their breath and cooking to escape. This created a slow, constant, almost imperceptible current of fresh air. For water, they had rolled a massive wooden barrel into the space before sealing the final wall. It held nearly 100 gallons, a colossal thermal battery that would stabilize the interior temperature, absorbing heat from the little stove and radiating it back slowly through the night. It was their quiet, liquid furnace. Food was stored in sealed crates packed into the insulated walls themselves, sacks of beans and flour, dried meats, and jars of rendered fat, all protected from the killing frost. They had built not just a shelter, but a self-sustaining world. The sky was the first to give warning. For days, it had been a pale, washed-out blue, a color without depth. Then, one morning, a strange, luminous band of pale yellow appeared on the northern horizon, a phenomenon the Plains tribes called a sundog. It was a sign of ice crystals suspended high in the atmosphere, a silent alarm. The birds knew. The usual flocks of winter finches were gone, having fled south in a sudden, panicked exodus days before. Anya, out checking her snares, noticed the prairie dog towns were unnaturally silent, their entrances sealed with tightly packed earth far earlier and more thoroughly than usual. The world was holding its breath. The first flakes began to fall not as gentle lacework, but as tiny, hard grains of ice, more like sand than snow. They didn't drift, they hissed across the ground, driven by a rising wind that had a new voice. It was not the familiar tearing sound of the autumn gales. This was a deep, resonant hum, the vibration of an immense power gathering itself. By midday, the world began to dissolve. The horizon vanished first, consumed by a churning wall of white. Then the nearby rises and dips in the prairie were erased, the landscape flattened into a featureless void. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, began a terrifying plunge. 10 below. 20. 30 below zero. The sound of the wind escalated from a hum to a full-throated, deafening roar. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of moving air and ice that slammed against their old cabin, tearing at its shingles, forcing needles of snow through every tiny crack. The world outside the railcar ceased to be a place. It became an event. It became a force of pure, abstract violence. From the relative safety of a town, a blizzard is a hardship. Out on the open plains, a storm of this magnitude, the kind that would later be given names like the White Death, was a geological event, as impersonal and as absolute as a flood or an earthquake. It was the prairie reminding its inhabitants that their presence was a temporary, fragile privilege. The time for preparation was over. The question was being asked. Inside the iron cabin, the world was shrunk to a space 40 feet long and 7 feet wide. It was a world of quiet and warmth. The apocalyptic roar of the wind, the sound that was driving men mad in their drafty cabins and shaking the foundations of sod houses, was here a distant, muffled hum. It was the sound of a faraway ocean, a background noise that only served to emphasize the profound stillness within. The temperature, measured by a precious thermometer hanging on the canvas wall, held steady at 62 degrees. Anya sat on a low stool, mending a tear in a shirt by the yellow light of a single tallow lamp, her needle moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Cottier was at a small table, grinding wheat in a small hand mill, the soft, grating sound a comforting counterpoint to the storm's muffled fury. Wolf lay stretched out on a wool rug near the stove, his tail thumping softly against the floor in his sleep. This was their vindication. This was the payoff for all the strange labor, for the mockery and the worried glances. The narrative of their survival was written in the physics of their creation. The foot of dead air between the inner wall and the outer steel shell was doing its work, an impassable gulf for the cold. The packed wool was a fortress of fluff. The tiny stove, fed only a few sticks of carefully dried willow at a time, glowed with a dull red heat, its convoluted flue radiating a gentle, consistent warmth throughout the space. The massive barrel of water, now a huge thermal mass, drank in the excess heat and breathed it back out, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations. They were not fighting the storm. They had simply refused it entry. They had built a place that operated by a different set of rules. While their neighbors huddled together, burning through their precious woodpiles at a terrifying rate, listening to the wind tear at their homes, the sisters lived in a state of grace. They moved through their established routines, cooking, mending, reading from one of the 3 books they owned. They were not surviving. They were living. They had diagnosed the illness of a prairie winter with perfect accuracy, and their prescription was not a bigger fire, but a better boundary. They had built a bubble of calm in the heart of chaos. The storm raged for 4 days. On the 5th morning, an unnatural silence fell. It was a silence more profound than any sound, the silence of a world buried alive. Inside the railcar, the sisters felt the change. The muffled roar was gone. Anya unlatched the heavy, insulated door, a plug of wool and canvas set into the frame. It took the combined strength of both of them to push it open against the drift outside. They were met with a solid wall of white. For 2 hours they dug, carving a narrow tunnel upwards through the densely packed snow. When Cottier's shovel finally broke through the surface, the light that flooded the tunnel was blinding, painfully pure. They emerged into a landscape reborn, an alien world of sculpted white dunes under a sky of impossible blue. Their old cabin was a lump in the snow, its roof sagging, one wall collapsed inward. The few trees that dotted the horizon were shattered skeletons encased in ice. There was no sign of life, no movement but the slow drift of steam from their own breath. They strapped on the snowshoes they had made from bent willow and rawhide and began the slow, arduous trek toward Prairie Ridge. The journey took hours. The world was featureless, the familiar landmarks gone, and they navigated by the sun and a compass. As they neared the settlement, the true cost of the storm became clear. A barn had been flattened into splinters. Frozen cattle stood like statues in the snow, caught by the storm in the open. They found Mr. Drummond standing numbly outside his store. The weight of the snow had collapsed the roof, ruining his stock and his livelihood. He looked at the two sisters, his eyes hollow. He didn't seem to recognize them at first. They looked too healthy, too calm. They found Mrs. Gable and her family huddled in their kitchen, the only room left intact in their soddy. They had survived by burning their furniture, their faces gaunt and smeared with soot. When Mrs. Gable saw Anya and Cottier standing in her doorway, rosy-cheeked and unharmed, her mind could not bridge the gap. She burst into tears. "We thought you were gone," she sobbed. "We prayed for your souls." Anya looked at the exhausted, shivering family. Cottier gave the simple, devastating reply that would become the cornerstone of their legend. "We were warm," she said. The story of what the sisters had done spread through the survivors not like a rumor, but like a revelation. When the snows finally began to melt, a procession of settlers made the pilgrimage out to the rusted railcar. They came expecting to see a miracle, or perhaps evidence of witchcraft. What they found was something far more powerful, a set of replicable principles. Mr. Drummond, his arrogance shattered by the blizzard, stood inside the cramped, warm space and ran his hand over the taut canvas wall, feeling the give of the wool beneath. He looked at the tiny, efficient stove, at the ingenious ventilation, at the space between the inner sanctum and the outer shell. He wasn't looking at a freak occurrence. He was looking at a blueprint. The iron cabin, as it came to be known, was not a curiosity, it was a classroom. The legend was not about the sisters' strange fortitude, but about their quiet intelligence. The ideas began to spread. Settlers, rebuilding their lives, started talking not just about the thickness of their walls, but about thermal breaks. They started incorporating air gaps into their new homes. They built smaller, more efficient stoves. They began to understand that a small, well-sealed, and intelligently insulated space was infinitely warmer and safer than a large, drafty one. The sisters' legacy was not the object they had built, but the idea they had proven, that the most powerful force on the prairie was not the wind or the cold, but a precise and observant mind. Their story became a foundational myth of the region, a testament to a different kind of pioneering spirit. It wasn't about conquering the land with brute force. It was about listening to it, understanding its nature, and adapting with quiet ingenuity. The story teaches a principle that extends far beyond the frozen plains of the 19th century. It suggests that our greatest challenges are often not overcome by direct confrontation. They are solved by creating a space where the problem's rules no longer apply. The sisters did not defeat the blizzard. They simply built a world it could not enter. They redefined the nature of shelter, proving that the strongest wall is not always the thickest, but the one that knows what to let in and what to keep out.